2 minutes until man begins the greatest adventure in his history, all of that long billion years or so. Because at 9:32 a.m., 3 hours and 32 minutes from now, from here in Florida, the Merritt Island Launch Complex at the Kennedy Space Center near what we used to know as Cape Canaveral is now known as Cape Kennedy. Man is about to launch himself on a trip to the moon with the expectation of landing there. 3 astronauts awakened at 4:15 this morning, an hour and 45 minutes ago, according to our time here, had a good breakfast and were pronounced fit as a fiddle and ready to go. The same is the story out on pad 39A, where you see that giant Saturn rocket waiting to take them on their historic trip to the moon. Neil Armstrong is waiting to go, and there's an announcement coming from Mission Control right now, which is that the count is holding as had been expected at this moment. It's been holding for just about an hour, which was expected. It was planned and programmed into the operations to give time to catch up. If anything were wrong, nothing is wrong. Even the weather has turned good for this mission this morning. Although there had been predictions of low clouds, the clouds are now going to be quite high, and apparently it will be a very simple matter to get this rocket off as far as weather is concerned this morning. The commander of this flight is a civilian, Neil Armstrong, 38 years old, from Wapakoneta, Ohio, blond, blue-eyed, 5 feet 11, 165 pounds, Purdue aeronautical engineer graduate of 55, 2 sons, Eric, 12, Mark 6, test pilot of X-15s, a naval aviator, 78 combat missions in Korea. Now a civilian, the man who is to put his foot, man's first foot, on the moon next Monday morning. The lunar module pilot who will descend those 9 steps from their lunar module, their landing craft, to the moon surface 20 minutes after Armstrong, is a United States Air Force Colonel Edwin E. Buzz Aldrin, Jr., 39 years old, Montclair, New Jersey. His father, retired United States Air Force Colonel also blond, blue-eyed, 5 feet 10 and 165 pounds, a West Pointer from the class of 51, graduated 3rd in his class, said to be the best scientific mind in the astronaut program. A doctorate in astronautics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 66 combat missions in Korea, and a veteran spacewalker, spent the longest time outside of a spacecraft off the Earth, some 5.5 hours, when he was the pilot of Gemini 12. Along with them goes Michael Collins, in the most important role perhaps of all, although his is not the fame of stepping on the moon. At 38 years old, a lieutenant colonel, also a West Point graduate, the son and grandson of generals of the Army. His brother also is a general of the Army. Michael Collins, who was born in Rome, Italy, while his father was in service there, will be the command module pilot. He is the man with the awesome responsibility of circling the moon 69 miles high in the command module, while Armstrong and Aldrin go down for their historic walk on the moon. And he, it must be, who will effect any rescue that can be made of those men after they get back off the surface of the moon, or if they cannot make a landing there and cannot come back for rendezvous. He cannot rescue them, however, if they are already on the moon's surface. And this is one of the inherent hazards, dangers of this most dangerous but most thrilling mission. Man going to the moon here this morning from this Florida launch complex aboard that Saturn rocket. There are thousands upon thousands of persons gathered here in Florida along these roads leading out to pad 39A. Some of them many, many miles away, but they hope to get a glimpse of that ascending rocket on this historic day. The rocket will put the men into orbit 115 miles above the Earth for 1.5 orbits, and then the 3rd stage will put them on their way toward the moon. Shortly after that point is reached, they will extract the lunar module from the 3rd stage rocket, and then they'll be on their own on the way for their 3-day voyage to the moon. They will get there on Sunday. They will make the landing on Sunday afternoon, and after a 10-hour rest period, Armstrong and Aldrin are scheduled to set foot on the moon on early Monday morning, Eastern Daylight Time.
This is CBS News color coverage of Man on the Moon. The epic journey of Apollo 11. This morning, the launch of astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. The start of the trip to the moon. Sponsored by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System, and the International Paper Company, where good ideas grow on trees, and Kellogg's. Kellogg's puts more in your morning. Reporting now from CBS News Apollo headquarters at Kennedy Space Center, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
They resumed the countdown on schedule 2 minutes after the hour, which puts them 3 hours at that time and 30 minutes, 3 hours and 30 minutes from launch time, 9:32 a.m. Ever since they first rolled this Saturn V out of the vehicle assembly building right by us here at the press site 3 miles from the launch pad, put it on that big launcher to take it out to the pad, things have gone exceedingly well with the flight of Apollo 11. There have been only one or two small glitches, as they call them, in the space program. Nothing serious, nothing that really gave them very much concern. And since the count really got down to the fundamentals here, and they began loading fuel, getting ready for the launching this morning, there have been no problems at all, we have been told. Similarly, there are no problems with the astronauts. They got a day's rest yesterday, although it did take a little time in the lunar module landing craft simulator. They expected not to do that, they told us, but they finally got in some last-minute practice. We are told they got a good night's sleep, are fit as a fiddle, and at this moment they're in the suiting up room getting ready for their trip out to the pad there, which should begin in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes from now. We are going to have the great privilege during the flight of Apollo 11 to have with us here at the CBS News Space Center our very dear old friend, and yours too, Wally Schirra, who, as you know, and I never thought I'd get around to this, Wally, but the man who needs no introduction. Wally Schirra, who has made a flight on every one of our space craft, in the Mercury program, in the Gemini program, in the Apollo program, the first to test the Apollo spacecraft, which has now been thoroughly wrung out thanks to your work and those who succeeded you in the Apollo program. And Wally's going to be with us for this flight to give us his expertise and a little bit of an inside look on what these astronauts are going through in this most historic missions. And right now, they're suiting up. And Wally, I noticed that they had, again, that scrambled egg, steak, toast, coffee, and orange juice. And you might give us an inside kind of a Sunday supplement story, if you will. Do they really have that? We've had, everybody's had that. Does the taste of every astronaut go the same for breakfast?
Interestingly enough, I decided I'd keep book on that. Went back over it, and I've had 5 of those breakfasts. The 3 flights, of course, would normally have 3, but if you recall on my Gemini, I had 2 extra ones. We didn't go for 2 occasions. On my Mercury flight, Deke Slayton and I, the night before, caught some fish in the ocean just off the Cape, and we had some of that. So we did vary one time that I know of. We had fish, steak, and eggs. I'll have to admit that may be one of the reasons I didn't care for any more breakfasts, of at least the steak type.
I don't think we were told about that at the time. I hate to learn at this late date that we had misinformation that morning, but I don't recall any variance from steak, toast, eggs, and all this sort of thing.
Well, it's not something we really would think of as a normal breakfast, but we try to store up energy for 5 or 6 hours in contrast to the typical breakfast that might be followed in 4 hours for lunch. And we have to work on that quantity of food prior to breaking out the food on board the spacecraft. So this is one of the reasons that we have what amounts to a large, wholesome breakfast, one that will give you energy.
Have you given up that old idea of the low residue sort of food?
We finally did on the missions where we're up for more than about 3 or 4 days. By that time, you have the normal bowel movement, and you just can't afford to go on an abnormal diet. I think that's probably the reason for it.
It really, in a way, Wally, though it is an illustration, isn't it, of how far we have come, really, in these 8 short years of manned flight. A lot of the bugaboos that we were so concerned about in the early days of flight, we didn't know much about. We put behind us. I mean, even the food now, you've got spoon food and packaged food.
At last. It's a real breakthrough for us. I think the greatest part, the fun of the Apollo in the sense of food, is that we have hot water. So we can reconstitute food and have warm meals. I don't have any fond memories of squeezing out what amounted to baby food on those first Mercury flights. That was not exactly an appealing meal.
Wally, right now they're suiting up. Is that a pretty tedious procedure?
No, we've worn our suits so many times, and of course each crew, particularly in this case, has had a backup role where they've had suits on before. We train in them quite often. Typically we go through 3 suits. We have a training suit that we'll use in all of the water training, underwater survival, on the surface of the water survival, the egress training. So that suit gets quite a rough treatment. So we wear those very often. Now this suit, for flight, of course, is our precious Sunday go-to-church suit. And we take good care of that one. And we have technicians that are very competent. We've had them with us since we started in the space business. And as the suits became more complicated, the technicians became more competent. So it turns out quite well. Part of this time, though, is devoted to pre-breathing, to purge the body of the nitrogen gas that we're normally breathing. And, of course, the cigarette smoke that I used to breathe.
You're a quitter, are you?
Yes, sir.
As far as that goes, that's one area where I suppose quitting gets merit marks. Last night, these fellows had their usual dinner. I don't know whether we've come up with film yet of that dinner or not. Apparently not. We expect to have it later if indeed any film was taken. I haven't read that there was, but usually about this hour of the morning of launch morning. You don't get to see many launch morning broadcasts, so this will all be new to you.
You're right.
Usually about this hour of the morning we roll up some film that was taken of the dinner. Maybe they decided that cameramen aren't any cleaner than presidents of the United States and decided that they couldn't have them in last night. I don't know. You do know that we had a little crisis around here during this last week, and after the astronauts had invited the President of the United States to share their last night dinner with them, the medical people in the program decided that that was a medical risk that they really would rather not assume. They have kept the astronauts under very close medical surveillance during this last couple of weeks, almost a form of medical isolation, so that they have a clear monitor on everyone with whom they've come in contact and any possible germs they might be taking to the moon with them, not for fear of in any way contaminating the moon, but so that they've got a clear monitor when they come back of what they had when they went out, and can determine whether anything new has been added in the way of germs upon their return from the moon. It's one of the unknown factors that this flight will help prove out as man begins a whole new era of his existence, an existence that up to now we could say quite glibly was an existence on Earth. This new existence is an existence extraterrestrially, away from Earth and on our nearest satellite planet, the Moon. One of the things that will be found out is whether indeed there is any form of living organism out there that these fellows could possibly bring back to Earth. And there's been a lot of speculation that maybe they could bring back some dread disease that man has never heard of, wouldn't recognize, and that we're all going to keel over shortly after they open the hatch of the spacecraft. This is obviously pretty wild speculation, but some very sincere and very respected scientists do say that we haven't gone perhaps quite far enough in that isolation procedure, though it is quite extensive. The men will be very well protected and isolated for a total of 21 days after they've stepped on the moon, and so will the rock samples that it is hoped they bring back. Well, Wally will be coming back very shortly, and we'll be here, of course, for the next 10 days until these men have been to the moon, have come back from the moon. It's not 10 days, it's 8 days, and until they return on Thursday, a week from tomorrow. The launch time is still on schedule for 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, just a little more than 3 hours from now. CBS News color coverage of the launch day of Apollo 11 will continue in a moment.
461 individual, separate, distinct parts. They don't mean much to you yet. In fact, not until Western Electric puts them together. Precisely, efficiently. Then all 461 parts turn into a Bell telephone, so that you can dial almost anywhere. To help you keep in touch, Western Electric backs up your Bell telephone company by making dependable phones and things that connect them. Does our name ring a bell? Yes, millions of them.
We are counting down toward the launch of the Apollo 11 to put man's feet on the moon. The count is at 3 hours and 14 minutes and counting. As you look at that Saturn V sitting out there waiting to belch forth its 7.5 million pounds of thrust to lift off at the hour specified at 9:32 a.m. The weather is good, a little bit of hazy cloud so high that it won't even bother the thousands upon thousands of spectators, many of whom camped overnight waiting for this historic moment when this rocket puts Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin on the way to the moon. The crowd is nothing like the million that were anticipated at one time, but it is reasonably heavy. Cars at some points along the beach are 7 or 8 deep. And this is the scene outside the Cape Kennedy Center, where the astronauts will be emerging very shortly, suited up, carrying their portable air conditioning equipment to get into the van for the short trip out here to pad 39A. All the announcements have been good and optimistic this morning. Fit as a fiddle and ready to go is the way the astronauts were described. We are waiting for any further word from, this is either mission control in Houston or launch control here. Which is it, Wally? Launch control out here at the Space Center on Merritt Island. The control of the launch is from here until liftoff, and then it moves to Houston, Texas, where the Manned Spacecraft Center takes over and controls the rest of the mission. Here is a scene at that 320-foot level. That is the hatch of the Apollo 11 in the so-called White Room, one of the white and clean rooms through which the spacecraft and its booster have been throughout their construction, kept that way until launch. The cleanliness to keep extraneous dirt as well as parts and so forth out of the spacecraft, where once in weightless state they could float around and get caught in the controls and cause all kinds of trouble, presumably. These things are manufactured with hospital attention to cleanliness. And as you see, the few people who are permitted in the White Room for the last-minute checkout procedures are wearing their white clean suits and their caps to keep any stray hairs even from getting aboard the spacecraft. Wally, was it on your first Mercury flight, or was it somebody else? That kind of look at those. That's a beautiful shot of those 5 bells, that each of which belch out that 1.5 million pounds of thrust.
Rather an amazing engine when you think of it. We envisioned, about 30 engines, I believe, in the first design of this system, and here we have 5, so we've advanced fantastically.
Those outboard engines, let's see, outboard engine's gimbal.
That's correct,
yeah.
Yes.
And the engine in the center does not. They are the ones that have the load of getting the 6,100,000 pounds off the pad, over 3,000 tons, that 36-story high rocket and its precious payload of the command module bearing the 3 astronauts weighs. It stands out on the pad, and it's with the umbilical tower alongside, carrying the fuel oxidizers and electrical connections, the last-minute things that are necessary. That is the spacecraft and the escape rocket, I think, isn't it?
Yes, to the left
right,
you
yeah.
see the White Room that we were just looking inside of a few shots ago.
Still, the cocoon is still around the command module. That is broken open and pulled back
Yes.
about, quite a few minutes before launch, actually. They're up there alone.
It's about T-minus 30 we pull it back, and this, of course, enables the crew to use the escape system if it's necessary. Up until that time, they can exit through the swing arm and through that White Room.
You can see now, right at the top of the rocket, that slender little point. That is the escape tower that has the rocket engine in it, which pulls that command module free if there's a last-minute serious problem. You can pull it free and can take it all the way 500 miles downrange, isn't it, Wally?
Depending on when that might be exercised, we use it for what we call an off-the-pad escape, where there's no time to bring the gantry swing arm back in again. This permits us to get about, almost 5,000 feet altitude, then deploy the normal recovery parachutes. In addition, it's used during all the first stage flight to pull away in case that system does fail. So you can go downrange quite far, of course.
Short of that, and downrange, of course, there are ships and frogmen waiting to snatch the astronauts out of the water if that dire situation develops. And short of that, there are the other escape methods. Either that amusement park, well, both of them are kind of amusement park. That amusement park slide down to the safe room, buried and suspended on springs under the launch pad and a few yards away, or that long slide wire which can be used. Or if it's not that urgent, the astronauts can come back down the elevator, which you will see them ascend in a very short while. We're kind of vamping to ready here because we have been told that the astronauts are to emerge from the Manned Space Center at any moment now, although their schedule called for it, not for another 12 minutes or so. But we have been advised that they may come out a little bit early. Everything has been going a little early on this flight. That does not mean that they would take off early. The timelines are very rigid for the flight, and it's not going to be launched before 9:32. No matter what time the astronauts get there, no matter how anxious they are to go.
I just noticed something. My backup time system is working, but our clock is not. The countdown clock is. So
Yeah.
It just shows why we wear wristwatches on these flights.
Well, thank you, Wally. You can fly co-pilot with me anytime.
Thank you, sir.
We're 2 minutes away, aren't we? The
That's
clock
right.
has stopped. You know, one way you can tell whether the clock has stopped or not is if the second hand doesn't work any longer. I ought to know that. That thing did stop on us, and I hope that Mr. Fox, our stage manager, is listening and is going to get this clock fixed for us as quickly as possible.
It's quite interesting, by the way. We all have selected watches that we'll wear on the flight. We wear them on the outside of the wrist just for that very purpose, to back up the time system, because it's quite critical to us during countdown and during the flight itself.
See, that is interesting.
Somehow.
Well, wristwatch is a help. I'm going to have to get some backup system here for this one. Where then, Wally, according to your watch and mine, it is just a minute. Right?
I'm on 1 minute. Yes,
1 minute till they're supposed to emerge, so that this early departure is not coming about after all. However, I'll go back a minute, and everything else has been early on this flight. They have run ahead of their timeline in getting the rocket prepared and the spacecraft, but as I said a moment ago, launch will come at 9:32. The times are quite critical. The arrival time at the moon is the critical point. The time of landing at the landing site is critical. The lighting conditions, they want to have just right on that landing point. And those lighting conditions should be early dawn type conditions. The sun way over there in the east, the shadows therefore very distinct, very clear in the crater areas. As the sun gets overhead on the moon, although it takes it 14 days to cross the moon, it's a 14 Earth day, a long day on the moon. Kind of a tricky little phrase, but it does take the sun 14 days to cross. But when the time it gets to its zenith, halfway through that, a week into that, these features on the moon just blank out. You can't see them from altitude. There's no shadow to give any definition to the craters, which could make it very dangerous getting down on that surface.
It's very hard to get depth perception for the landing itself without this shaded area. That's a very good description.
So, thank you. So the timeline is quite important. Also, the timeline on this flight is following, as specifically as it can, the timeline on the Apollo 10 flight, which Tom Stafford and his crew made a couple of months ago. They made that flight to survey this landing zone from 10 miles high to find out what the problems were with the lighting at that time and with with the spacecraft systems to be tested in the lunar environment for the first time. They made that test, and here it looks as if they're about to come out.
Oh, great.
Let's listen to the voice of Mission Control here.
T-minus 3 hours, 4 minutes, 32 seconds, and counting. Right on time as far as the astronaut countdown is concerned. The prime crew now departing from their crew quarters here at the Kennedy Space Center. Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and then finally Mike Collins, plus their suit technicians and Director of Flight Crew Operations Deke Slayton now boarding the transfer van for the trip to the launch pad. Slayton actually will drop off from the transfer van as it passes by here at the Launch Control Center. The trip in the transfer van should take some 15 minutes or so to reach the pad, at which time the astronauts will board the first of 2 elevators for the trip to the 320-foot level at the launch pad, where they will then proceed to ingress the spacecraft. At the present time, the backup lunar module pilot, astronaut Fred Hayes, is already aboard the Apollo 11 spacecraft, performing some preliminary checks. This work includes checking the chlorine content of the water supply and adjusting the cabin lights inside the spacecraft in preparation for the arrival. We logged the departure from the building at about 6:27 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The transfer van now departing from the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building at the Kennedy Space Center on the start of its 8-mile trip to Launch Pad A here at Complex 39, where the Saturn V launch vehicle now fully loaded with propellants and the spacecraft going through preliminary checkouts. Right now, our count at 3 hours, 3 minutes and counting, aiming toward the planned liftoff time of 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. This is Launch Control.
They're due back, they're due at the pad 12 minutes from departure, according to the timeline here. That would be, since they departed at 6:27, that would be, I figured, 6:39. And that's going to put them 2 minutes late, which really won't do anything to this program, I suppose, Wally. What do you talk about in that van on the way over?
That's interesting, because we had problems at first, and we have a As you noticed in that shot, the men are in their suits, they're sealed up. We're on pure oxygen at this point. That's the contrivance they're carrying. It's a ventilator, and it's a pure oxygen ventilator. So we're continually purging. But finally, the communication system did work, and I think we probably typically remarked about the crowd that saw us off. I think you noticed even at that hour how many people were out there watching us boarding this transfer van. It's quite a treat because the people you've been working with for months down here are all out there no matter what the hour. Now here we're starting out quite early. On my Apollo 7 flight, we had a banker's launch. We left at about 11, so it wasn't so bad for everybody. Even those on the West Coast didn't have to get up too early.
We were very appreciative of that, Wally. Well, in those early days out here, we used to be out here all night long waiting for those early morning launches. And in those days, we were outside, and the mosquitoes were heavy, and the rattlers were rattling, and the alligators were snapping. Well, it wasn't quite that bad, but the mosquitoes were biting at any rate. And we were told there were rattlers around somewhere along the line. Well, that's what you talk about. Would you dare tell us what you think about?
I think at this point in time, you're well prepared and sort of get on with it. I think the quote that Deke Slayton would probably pass on would be something like, well, let's get this thing going. It's now time to get on with the next step, which is to go fly it.
Were you looking over my shoulder?
No, it's typical.
Well,
do you have it?
Let me report to you that what Deke Slayton said this morning was that Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are up and charging, that they have no special thoughts to express at this point on the historic mission they're about to undertake, but as Slayton put it, they're ready for work. So you just about said it. It's getting to, you suppose that after all of you guys came out of these computers to be selected as astronauts, with your same kind of backgrounds of test flying and then going through this whole thing, do you think that your reactions have become kind of standardized?
No, I think really what you saw there is that it's difficult to give a statement about what you're thinking about because you are thinking. You're not expressing it verbally. We don't sit in the van and backslap each other and kid around. It starts getting quite serious at that time, and you're sort of looking inward and focusing on what's going on and how are we doing on the count. And I always had a devil of a time trying to figure out this minus count thing this far back. So I had to keep looking at some kind of prepared paper to tell us where we were on the program.
CBS News color coverage of the launch day of Apollo 11 will continue in a moment.
I'll bet nobody can tell by looking. But you know what? This terrific bikini was made by a paper company. The International Paper Company made it just for me, to show off their new material, Confil. I wouldn't dream of calling it paper, though. Paper usually creases and rustles and scratches, but Confil is smooth and silky and soft and strong. Here goes.
Confil's fantastic. It is like paper in one way. So cheap you can just throw it away.
Confil, from the International Paper Company, where good ideas grow on trees.
Well, it's 2 hours, 58 minutes, and 20 seconds, and counting, as you see, toward the launch of the Saturn V that will take Apollo 11 to the moon and hopefully take Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to a landing on the moon. Earlier this morning, as we reported to you, the astronauts had their usual big, fulsome breakfast ready for this launch of the Apollo 11, and perhaps we can take a look at the film of that breakfast this morning. And there it is. Can you identify those people, Wally?
That's the crew on the left side. I think it looks like Mike Collins, and well, there's Mike, of course, on a close-up. And they're chewing hard enough, so it must be that good old steak we were discussing earlier.
I hope the scrambled eggs didn't require that effort.
Oh, of course, there's Buzz Aldrin. And they look pretty chipper. That's the best sign I can ever give a report on as to how the crew looks. Before we were put in almost isolation, as you see it in this case, for the, as you were discussing the
There's
journey.
Neil
Oh, here's
Armstrong.
Neil. We'd have very close friends in the program in with us for breakfast. My technique was to use those in NASA and with the contractors who were directly involved with the flight to see how they felt that morning. If they looked confident, I was completely prepared.
I think they, because of this isolation, they sort of limited their breakfast guests. It doesn't look like there's many there as usual.
No, I think I saw Deke Slayton on this side of the table. His back is to us there, and I'm not sure who that is with the checkered shirt.
Deke wear that same shirt every launch? It seems that
We
I've
have
seen it
that,
before.
this is almost our uniform down here, this type of short sleeve shirt. It's a very easy one to maintain and wash.
Looks like they're still talking business there. Look, they've got a map. That was I think an Earth orbital map, wasn't it?
It is, and I'm quite sure it's the weather report. We have the world weather put on this orbital chart, and we'll get our weather briefing usually at this time, because from shortly after this, we're suited up and you can't really look at things as easily like this weather map. I still have my Mercury weather map, in fact, and it showed a couple of hurricanes, one in the Pacific and one in the Atlantic.
I remember you reported to us on seeing those for the first time. First time we'd had such a report from space. The weather here is good for launch. There is very little wind, and that's one of the main constraints, isn't it, Wally, on the flight. It should be clear, plenty of observation for the cameras, and that first 500 feet are critical before radar locks on. That's got to be, visibility has to be very good at that point. There's no problem. From the roof of the vehicle assembly building, you can see some of the traffic on the way out here to the launch site. We're 3 miles from the...
That's the transfer van, in fact. See the flashing light? That traffic is significant this morning. That particular traffic. Without it, we wouldn't have much of a crew on board, would we?
They're clearing one side of the road for them to get through. You see the buses that carry these VIPs out here. They're supposed to be something like 300 congressmen, 1,500 very important persons, guests here, led by the former President Johnson, whose efforts really helped create this space program as Senator and Vice President, head of the Space Committee under Kennedy, and then as President himself. Vice President Agnew is here. He's the present head of the Space Committee. And he made an interesting statement on arrival, Wally. He said that we must have a big new space program to move ahead with. I'll get the exact quote on that shortly. But there is a lot of traffic. People started out here, some of the very important guests started out here at 5 o'clock this morning for fear that that traffic might hold them up. They don't want to be caught on the road behind a great clump of trees just when this rocket launches this morning. While the weather here is beautiful, it's not so good in Houston, or, well, it is good in Houston. They're delighted in Houston because their drought was broken by quite a thunderstorm, lasted throughout the night, including a little episode in which it smashed a tree out in Mike Collins' front yard, knocked one of his hackberry trees down with a great resounding crash, and apparently gave Mrs. Collins quite a start. City crew, though, you'll be glad to know things are working well down there at the Space Center. City crew was out immediately, cut it up, and had it off the lawn practically before the reporters showed up this morning.
Very good.
Out at Wapakoneta, Ohio, this is Violet Armstrong. Neil Armstrong's mother is, we assume, up by this time. She had a busy day yesterday dusting. Well, her son was getting ready for space. She said she had to finish her last-minute dusting before the newspapermen arrived.
Good for her. That probably is very significant because it means that it's a normal way of doing things. And I think that's where women excel over men. They manage to make a normal routine seem to make the world go along very nicely.
Only one of the astronauts' wives is here at the Cape, and that's Mrs. Armstrong. Jan Armstrong did come to watch the launch. Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Aldrin stayed home in Houston. Van is now inside the... Is it inside the complex here?
That must be,
like
because
it
it looks like there's no other traffic at all. This is where
yeah,
everybody's
it
moved
should
out.
be just passing the first parking lot over there. It looked as if. Should be able to see it out of our window here shortly. This is an unmanned camera on top of the vehicle assembly building. That building in cubic footage is the largest building in the world. Stopping alongside the VAB. They're letting Slayton off probably,
sure,
aren't they?
that's exactly what it is. I think Deke would like to go along, but unfortunately there isn't a four-seater available just now.
We all felt very, very bad about Deke Slayton and the original U-7 Mercury astronauts, and that little tiny heart murmur kept him off the active flight list.
Deke is one of our best men, of course, and I'm not sure many people know it, but when it came time to pick the chief astronaut, we got together and picked Deke rather than have somebody recruited and brought in, and he's done a fantastic job. It's been a tremendous workload for him.
Well, it really has. While you fellows in training go through this long 2-year period, you peak at a point, and then you can taper off a little bit, and he peaks for every one and has to keep going. Now they're on the last 3 miles to launch pad 39A, going down the service road toward the launch pad, passing by that broad road over on the left, which is the launcher road, which that huge piece of machinery passes to take the 36-story Saturn out to the pad. Those launchers are among the gee whiz items here.
Do you recall the vital statistic, one tread on that crawler, one tread, just the one little bar, weighs a ton? It really amazes me.
You know, they talked about the trouble they had with the roller bearings at first with that crawler. They found that they weren't taking equal stress. The 8 bearings on each side of for each set of treads, and they weren't taking equal stress. Therefore, the thing was bogging down. One of the early hitches in the program, and I was thinking of bearings about like those you get on a pair of roller skates, I guess. I took a look at that thing, and each bearing, the hatch to open the thing is as big as your arms around. They're huge. You know what that launcher does? It comes on the tracks there that you see, those 2 wide set of tracks there. Those are the tracks, left and right side, and they come down. It comes down at half a mile an hour, or a little less than that even, 1/3 of a mile an hour. Down into the vehicle assembly building, and they actually build the rocket right there on it. Assemble, that is, the 3 stages, the instrument unit, the command and service modules, the tower, they put all of that on, and then the whole thing, the 36 stories of it, is wheeled out on this launcher, on its treads, down that long, that railroad-looking track there, the 3 miles to the launch pad. And then at the launch pad, it climbs a little hill even, gets up top of the launch pad, they put jacks under it and wheel the launch vehicle out from under it, and it's in its service structure. CBS News color coverage of the launch day of Apollo 11 will continue in a moment.
In Kellogg's Corn Flakes you get more of the marvelous things in store for you in corn. You get more of the marvelous richness, more of the marvelous flavor, more of the marvelous nourishment of corn to savor. Crisp by Kellogg's into famous flakes with more of the marvelous morness. Kellogg's Corn Flakes morness, more of the marvelous morness of corn.
Jennifer, what a darling maternity dress. Oh, you're not?
Time to get back into things. Eat smart at every meal, starting with breakfast. Kellogg's Special K breakfast is only 240 calories, 99% fat-free. And delicious Special K is loaded with protein. Let the Special K breakfast help you get back into things.
Doesn't Jennifer look slinky? What a figure.
I hate her. Oh, hi, Jen.
It's 2 hours, 47 minutes and counting to the launch of Apollo 11 toward the moon. And the 3 astronauts are on the last few hundred yards on their way to pad 39A. You see them, their van there, crossing this lowland just off the beaches at Cape Kennedy. This actually is Merritt Island at the Cape. They're running a little bit behind time now. It won't affect the launch time, presumably, unless there are other delays. This itself will not affect the launch, probably. But due to the heavy traffic coming out here, and despite their escort, they are running behind. And normally, the trip is scheduled to take 12 minutes, and they've been underway now some 17 minutes already. They're not quite there yet. They were due there at 6:37. It's now 6:46.
I think that 37 may have been arrival in the pad area where we saw Deke Slayton dropped off, so we may... Well, our next check will be at 6:52, won't it? If they're not in by then, we know we've lost some time.
That's when they're to begin getting into the spaceship itself. Here's an announcement from Jack King.
Michael Collin and Edwin Aldrin are on the terminal part of their trip to the launch pad in the transfer van. It's now making the curve toward the pad. We have discovered a problem at the launch pad itself as the crew is about to arrive. We have a leak in a valve located in a system associated with replenishing liquid hydrogen for the 3rd stage of the Saturn V launch vehicle. This is a piece of ground support equipment, actually. It is not on the rocket itself. It's located on the tower of the mobile launcher at the 200-foot level. This valve is leaking. We had a problem with this same valve during our countdown demonstration test previously. We have sent a team of 3 technicians and a safety man to the pad, and these technicians are now tightening bolts around the valve. Once the technicians depart, we will send hydrogen again through this system to assure that the leak has been corrected. The astronauts now coming up toward the pad itself as the crew of several technicians at the 200-foot level proceed to tighten some bolts around a leaking valve. Once again, this valve is associated with the system that replenishes liquid hydrogen for the 3rd stage of the Saturn V launch vehicle. Because of the extremely low temperatures of the hydrogen, it continues to boil off during these phases of the count, and we continue to replenish the supply down to the final moments of the count to assure that we have 100% aboard. The crew is working on the valve at this time, and the crew went in a short time ago, and they're going to be followed shortly by the astronaut team, which has just arrived at the pad, the transfer van now backing up toward the elevator. In a matter of 5 minutes or so, we'll be ready for the spacecraft commander, Neil Armstrong, to come across the sill at the 320-foot level. That is our status at 2 hours, 43 minutes, 47 seconds, and counting. This is launch control.
And you see there the launch van backing up to the launch structure itself. They enter a small elevator cage here, go up a couple of floors, make a transfer a few feet over to the high-speed elevator, which then takes them up. There you see them. Kind of a long shot. Not a long shot for success of the mission, but a long pictorial shot here. These men are extremely confident over the success of their mission. They have acknowledged that perhaps the figure is 80% for complete success, but that means actually accomplishing all of the test objectives of landing on the moon. It does not mean necessarily 80% chance of a successful return to Earth. That they're confident of. The space program is confident. a salute as they went up the elevator. I haven't seen that before from a...
No, that was quite something. I frankly never have looked back. This is the first time I've looked over to see someone saluting. We do have some military men on loan with us as suit technicians, and that may have been just his tribute to the crew.
It's a kind of a Orson Wellesian shot, isn't it, with the lighting? There they come out of that cage. It took them up the 2 floors. We've never had this shot before, and you see they cross those few feet into this door, then down a passage which very much like a battleship corridor, painted gray, and hatches in the same fashion for the same reasons, to keep it air and watertight. This area is deluged by thousands upon thousands of gallons of water, beginning half an hour before the launch and continuing for 10 minutes or so after the launch to help dampen the intense flame from those booster engines. I don't know exactly what point. Oh, these are the fellows working on that valve, I guess.
Oh, of course. I see
yeah.
the picture better now. That's kind of an interesting team that they have around the launch pad complex. There's some pretty brave men in there. Some that are prepared to get us out, almost risking their lives to do it. Of course, these men are putting on a little bit of extra work themselves, as you can see.
There's a whole fleet of, I guess along that catwalk we'll be seeing the astronauts shortly when they get to that level, 320-foot level. I assume that's the picture of the 320-foot level. Here's Jack King.
And counting. At this time, the prime crew for Apollo 11 has boarded the high-speed elevator from inside the A level in the mobile launcher, which is the second level inside the launcher. This is a high-speed elevator, 600 feet per minute, which will carry them to the 320-foot level, the spacecraft level. Shortly, we'll expect astronauts Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins to come across swing arm 9, the Apollo access arm, and proceed to the White Room and stand by to board the spacecraft. The third member of the crew, astronaut Edwin Aldrin, who will be the last one to board the spacecraft, will stand by in the elevator, seated in a chair, while his 2 comrades first board the spacecraft. Once Armstrong, who sits in the left-hand seat, and Collins, who will sit in the right-hand seat during liftoff, are aboard, then Aldrin will be called, and he will take his seat, the middle seat in the spacecraft. The spacecraft commander, Neil Armstrong, and the command module pilot, Michael Collins, now proceeding across the swing arm into the small White Room that attaches at the spacecraft level. In the meantime, about 100 feet below, we have a team of technicians working on a leaking valve, which is a part of the ground support equipment, a part of the system that's used to replenish the fuel supply for the 3rd stage of the Saturn V rocket. He is proceeding to tighten a series of bolts around this valve in the hope that this will correct the leak. Once the technicians do depart, the hydrogen will again be flowed through the system to assure that the leak has been corrected. The spacecraft commander, Neil Armstrong, and CMP, the command module pilot, Mike Collins, now standing by in the White Room. T-minus 2 hours, 38 minutes, 45 seconds and counting. This is launch control.
Well, it doesn't look like they're going to lose time getting into the spacecraft, and they're going to just about get back on time, maybe a couple of minutes late in ingress getting into the spacecraft, but that won't affect the timeline. They've got a margin in there. I thought I saw in Collins the back of Armstrong's suit rather a moment ago, a big black, what looked like a black patch across the back.
I saw that too, and I'm not sure what it was. It might be a reflective material there, or it might also be something that prevents abrasion on the back of the suit. It's something I'm not familiar with. Yeah. We've had some trouble with this material wearing. I'm sure it wasn't a patch. At least we have better control of our tailors than that.
Well, as we wait for this ingress, we are just about to step foot over the sill. It looked like there now. Still carrying his portable oxygen equipment, And there it moved up to the hatch.
We have to keep that on until we get on the ship's system. Otherwise, we have nothing to breathe in the suit. The suit will breathe down, is a term we use. It really means we actually consume the oxygen in the suit within a very short period of time.
They're just taking off his booties, wear a little protective covering over the boots while still on Earth there to avoid wear and contamination, picking up dirt to carry into the spacecraft. This is one of the best pictures we've had of the hatch. They've toned up that fixed camera up there on that 320-foot level in the White Room. They've got 60 cameras, incidentally, placed around the spacecraft, the launch tower. The space agency has 60 television cameras by which they monitor these things. CBS News color coverage of the launch day of Apollo 11 will continue in a moment.
Maxim freeze-dried coffee brings you 14 exciting summertime uses for your percolator. We do this now because it's time to enjoy a tall, frosty glass of iced Maxim and use your percolator for other things. One sip of iced Maxim will probably make you want to try hot Maxim as soon as things cool off. Then we'll have to bring you 14 exciting winter uses for your percolator. For a refreshing summer change, try iced Maxim. You may never perk again.
They're at the 320-foot level with 2 hours and 35 minutes to launch time, which will be 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time. The astronauts are just about to get aboard the spacecraft. They have been up now for 2 hours and 45 minutes. They're pronounced fit as a fiddle and ready to go. The spacecraft is ready to go. A small little problem developed 10 minutes ago with a leak in one of the valves, the ground support equipment supplying liquid hydrogen to the upper stage of the Saturn rocket. They still have not, Neil Armstrong still has not gotten aboard. Or maybe Neil has gone aboard, and that may be Michael Collins waiting there outside.
I suspect that would be right, Walter.
I think so.
Neil would go aboard first, I'm sure.
Jack King.
Into the cabin at 6:54 a.m. Eastern Daylight.
Yep.
Since that time, the commander has now been tied into the system and has checked in over the communication lines. He was wished a good morning by the spacecraft test conductor, Skip Chauvin, and Armstrong, in return, said it looks like a good morning. In the meantime, 120 feet below him, the technicians continuing to work to tighten bolts around a leaking valve associated with the system that replenishes hydrogen fuel for the third stage. To repeat once again, this is not a problem on the launch vehicle itself, but on the ground support equipment associated with it.
And we'll be continuing our live coverage of this launch of Apollo 11 on this historic day shortly.
This has been CBS News color coverage of Man on the Moon, the epic journey of Apollo 11, sponsored by the International Paper Company, where good ideas grow on trees, and Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell system, and Maxim freeze-dried coffee. CBS News color coverage of the epic journey of Apollo 11 continues with the CBS Morning News with Joseph Benty. This is CBS.